Report 1. A few months ago, I accepted a job offer in a small town in the countryside. The location was surrounded by dense forests and mountains, perfect for those who enjoy exploring. One night, a co-worker told me about an abandoned bunker nearby, used during the Cold War. According to him, the place had been closed abruptly, but no one knew the reason. The bunker was located about 5 kilometers from a nearby village, hidden in the woods. The idea of exploring that place seemed interesting to me. I decided to go alone. I arrived at the entrance of the bunker as I started. The place was surrounded by a rusty fence, partially covered by bushes. The steel door of the bunker was ajar, revealing absolute darkness inside. There were rust marks on the surface, and a faded military symbol could be seen in the upper corner. Before entering, I took a look around. The silence was absolute, except for the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I took a deep breath and turned on my flashlight before crossing the threshold. Right at the entrance, a narrow corridor extended into what seemed to be a constructed maze. The air was damp and had a scent of aged metal mixed with something stronger, almost chemical. My boots echoed softly on the concrete floor as I moved forward. I walked for a few minutes, lighting up the walls with my flashlight. They were covered in hasty scratches and marks. In some places, there were strange symbols drawn with something dark, like charcoal or dried blood. I reached a large room that seemed to have been used as a dormitory. There were rusty bunk beds, disintegrated mattresses, and personal belongings scattered across the floor. I found a metal mug still full of a black, dry liquid. One strange detail caught my attention, a message carved into the wall with something sharp. It read, "Don't look at them." My heart began to race, but I convinced myself it was just a prank by previous explorers. I decided to continue. I followed another corridor, this time narrower and with old, unused lamps on the ceiling all turned off. It was then that I heard the first sound, a low crack like metal being scratched. I instinctively turned off the flashlight, holding my breath. The sound continued for a few seconds before stopping abruptly. I turned the light back on, illuminating the empty corridor. "Just the building settling," I murmured to myself, trying to laugh it off. After a few minutes, I found a staircase leading down even further into the bunker. The air grew heavier as I descended, and the chemical smell intensified. The corridor below was different. The walls had burn marks, and there were signs that something heavy had been dragged recently. At the end of the corridor, I found a large steel door, almost completely closed. As I approached, I noticed a small opening, just enough to fit my hand through. I peeked through it, but all I saw was darkness. I decided to push the door. It opened slowly, with a loud creak that echoed through the bunker. Inside, there was a huge circular room with a ceiling so high that my flashlight barely reached it. In the center of the room was something strange, a metal table surrounded by old machines, all covered by a thick layer of dust. On the table, there was something covered by a white sheet, which seemed to have been there for a long time. As I approached, the sound of waves returned. This time, it was louder and seemed to come from inside the room. I illuminated the walls and saw something that made my blood run cold. Deep, recent claw marks, as if something had been trying to get out. It was then that I heard a low breathing sound. I immediately turned off the flashlight, but my curiosity was stronger. Slowly, I lifted the sheet from the table. Underneath, there was a mannequin, or at least it looked like one. The skin was gray and shiny, with visible black veins. The eyes were closed but too lifelike, as if they could open at any moment. Before I could analyze what I was seeing, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow but heavy. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing. The sound stopped, and the room fell into absolute silence. That's when I realized something had changed. The mannequin on the table was now sitting up. Its eyes were open, fixed on me, glowing with a silvery hue. I was paralyzed, unable to move. It tilted its head awkwardly as if analyzing me. Suddenly it began to get down from the table, its movements quick and erratic like an injured animal. That was enough to snap me out of my trance. I ran out of the room, climbing the stairs as fast as I could. As I ran, the scratching sounds and footsteps began again, now following me. They were so loud and close that it felt like the thing was about to catch me. When I finally reached the ground floor, the entrance through which I had come was now completely blocked. I don't remember how, but I found a small opening in another wall and forced myself through it, escaping into the forest. I only stopped running when I spotted my car. I got in and sped away from there, never looking back. Since that night I have constant nightmares. I see the silvery eyes of that thing every time I close my eyes, and sometimes, when I'm home alone, I hear footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, as if it's looking for me. I still wonder what that bunker really hid, and I deeply regret having entered. Report 2. Introduction. It was the perfect weekend for an exploration. My friend Nick and I had always been fascinated by abandoned places, and that bunker forgotten in the middle of a forest seemed irresistible. The few pieces of information we found said it had been used as a military laboratory, but had been closed decades ago after a mysterious accident. To protect ourselves from anything we might encounter, toxic dust, mold, or chemicals, we wore white protective suits and masks. Looking back, I realized that being physically prepared didn't mean we were ready for what we truly faced inside. The bunker was about a 40-minute walk down an almost overgrown trail. The entrance was a large, slanted steel gate, semi-buried, with a faint sunlight reflecting off the rust. It seemed like no one had passed through there in years. We put on our suits and masks before entering. Nick was excited, laughing and taking pictures of the gate with his powerful flashlight. I, on the other hand, felt a growing discomfort, as if the very air around us was wrong. The first thing I noticed upon entering was the smell, metallic, chemical, and dense. The main corridor was narrow, with metal-lined walls. The sound of our boots echoed in all directions, and the silence between us was almost deafening. The corridor led to a large room that seemed like a decontamination area. There were metal cabinets and remnants of medical equipment scattered across the floor. One of the cabinets was ajar, revealing empty vials with illegible labels. While Nick explored the room, something caught my attention. There were marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged into a corridor on the right. Pointing them out, I called Nick. "Did you see this?" He looked, but shrugged. "Probably old equipment." "Relax, man." We followed the marks, which led us to another room with several metal tables and broken equipment. In the center was a tube monitor still on, with a flickering static light on the screen. Nick moved closer and touched the monitor, but it turned off by itself, as if it knew we were there. That's when we heard the sound. Something metallic, like a door slamming in the distance. "What was that?" I asked, trying to keep calm. Nick understood, but I could see he was nervous. "Probably the wind," he said, though there was no breeze down there. We decided to keep exploring. At the end of the corridor, we found a staircase leading even deeper into the bunker. Below, the air was even heavier, and the feeling of being watched grew with every step. Descending, we came to a corridor with doors on both sides. Some were open, revealing empty rooms with burn marks on the walls. In one room, there was a panel full of buttons and levers with labels in Russian or German. We couldn't understand. Nick found a notebook attached to a clipboard. The pages were faded, but one word appeared several times: subject. "This is getting weird," he murmured. Before we could process what that meant, we heard something in the corridor. Footsteps, slow but steady, like heavy boots hitting the floor. We turned off our flashlights and fell silent. The footsteps approached but then stopped, as if the person knew exactly where we were. Suddenly, the door at the end of the corridor began to open. The faint light from the room on the other side revealed a tall, thin shadow. Whoever it was wore a jumpsuit similar to ours, but it was covered in dark stains and looked dirty, as if it had been there for decades. "Hey, who are you?" Nick called out, but there was no response. The figure stood still for a few seconds before tilting its head awkwardly. Then it began to walk toward us. Nick grabbed my hand, and we started running back down the corridor. The footsteps behind us quickened, as if the thing was chasing us. We climbed the staircase as fast as our boots would allow, but our footsteps continued, now accompanied by a metallic sound, like claws on the walls. We reached the decontamination area, panting. I looked back and saw the figure standing at the top of the stairs, motionless, with its head still tilted. Nick pushed against the main door of the bunker, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was blocking it from the outside. Desperate, I looked at Nick. "Is there another way out?" He shook his head. Before we could think of anything, we heard a sound. It was no longer footsteps. It was breathing, heavy, irregular, and it seemed to be coming from all directions. Suddenly, the bunker lights, which had been off until then, started to flicker. One by one, they illuminated the corridors around us. That's when we realized the figure wasn't alone. Other shadows began to appear, all wearing the same stained jumpsuits. Some were crouched, others standing, but all were watching us. Finally, the door gave way, and we both ran into the forest. We sprinted to our car and drove non-stop until we got home. Since that night, Nick and I have never spoken about the bunker again. But sometimes when I'm alone, I feel that chemical smell still lingering in the air. And at night, in the silence, I hear slow, dragging footsteps, as if something followed us to that place. Some places should never be explored. Report 3. A few years ago, my friend Ethan and I were obsessed with exploring abandoned places. Our goal was to find something unique, something that would set us apart from other explorers. That's when we heard about a military bunker hidden deep in a forest. They say it was used for secret experiments during the Cold War and was hastily closed after something went terribly wrong. The stories speak of disappearances and inexplicable things coming from underground. We ignored the warnings and decided to go. We arrived at the entrance of the bunker just before sunset. The steel gate was crooked, partially covered by bushes, and there were signs that no one had passed through there for decades. The structure was colossal, with the entrance sloping downwards, like an open mouth inviting darkness. Ethan brought powerful flashlights and masks, just for precaution. We entered cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness of the main corridor. The concrete walls were covered with water stains and claw marks that looked too deep to be made by ordinary tools. The air was cold and had a metallic smell that burned the throat. I felt a chill as soon as I stepped through the gate, but Ethan seemed unfazed. The corridors were a planned maze. Some doors were sealed with welding, while others stood open, revealing rooms with old machines, torn files, and furniture covered in dust. In one of the rooms, we found a table with something peculiar, a broken gas mask covered in what looked like soot. Next to it was a notebook with pages torn out, except for one where someone had hastily scrawled, "They can't get out." "Who can't get out?" Ethan laughed, trying to hide his nervousness. "Must be just a joke from some curious person." We kept walking until we found a large metal door at the end of a corridor. It was ajar, and the space it left opened up to a huge hall. We entered and saw several metal tables, overturned chairs, and old monitors still on, flickering with static. In the center of the hall was a giant glass tank, shattered into several pieces. The floor around it was wet, with marks that looked like dragged claws. "This isn't normal," I murmured. Ethan simply took a photo. That's when we heard the sound. Something fell with a metallic crash in the corridor we had just crossed. We instinctively turned off our flashlights and froze, trying to listen better. Footsteps, Slowly but firmly, they echoed towards the hall. The sound stopped at the entrance. Ethan squeezed my arm, and I knew he was scared too. Suddenly, a dim light flickered on the ceiling, illuminating for a second something that shouldn't be there. It was a figure, thin and deformed, crouched at the entrance of the hall. Its skin was translucent, and its hollow, ray-like eyes reflected as if they were made of glass. It turned its head towards us, but in a wrong way, as if the bones in its neck were broken. We stood paralyzed until Ethan whispered, "Run." We dashed to the other side of the hall, finding another corridor we hadn't seen before. The footsteps behind us quickened, and the sound of something scratching the walls was deafening. We reached a spiral staircase that descended even deeper. Ethan hesitated, but the noise behind us left no choice. We ran down, but the upper steps seemed endless. At the bottom of the staircase, we found a corridor with flickering lights. The walls were covered in marks, as if something had desperately clawed to get out. A low sound began to fill the corridor, something between a buzz and a moan. "Where is that coming from?" I asked, but Ethan was already trying to open a door at the end of the corridor. When he finally succeeded, he found a room different from all the others. In the center, there was a chair with metal straps and burn marks around it. On the ceiling, old cameras were pointed at the chair, and on the wall, a hand-painted message read, "Don't let their eyes meet yours." Before we could react, the sound of footsteps returned, now echoing through the corridor we had just crossed. The thing was getting closer. Ethan started pushing furniture in the room to block the entrance while I desperately searched for an exit. That's when I heard a sound behind me. In the corner of the room, something moved. I shone my flashlight and saw the impossible. Another figure, crouched, was watching us. It was smaller, but its eyes shone just as brightly. When I realized it was standing up, I screamed to Ethan, "There's more than one!" The figure in the room started running toward me, and the sound of its footsteps was heavy and irregular. I threw myself to the side, and it crashed into the wall, letting out a scream that made my ears hurt. Ethan managed to open another door, and we ran without looking back. The corridor seemed infinite, but we finally saw a light at the end. It was the exit of the bunker. When we got out, we realized it was already dawn. We ran to the car and drove in silence until we reached the city. Ethan never spoke about the bunker again, and I didn't press him. However, a few weeks later, he moved away without telling anyone. Since then, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night feeling like I'm being watched. And on particularly quiet nights, I hear a sound coming from outside my window. Footsteps, heavy, dragging, and always stopping right beneath my bed.